Okay, welcome everyone. So this evening we have James Short here to talk with us about an experience report on FAST, a scaling architecture, a vertical scaling architecture, as opposed to all of the other architectures, which are horizontal scaling approaches to Agile. I've known of James for a very long time. He and Diana Larson did an amazing Agile fluency project starting 4 years ago, 5 years ago, James. And you're on mute.
I think that was maybe 2015. I don't recall when we first came out with the Agile fluency model.
It could have been 7 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I discovered, and he's recently done a new edition of his book, and we'll see if we can get it to show up there. In both of our cases, the fonts are dancing. This is Agile Development. The Art of Agile Development is the name of the book. It's the second edition, and he was doing a piece on this for Philadelphia XP, the Philadelphia XP organization. And I tuned in. I was very interested to know more about what he would be saying about Agile development. And as a side note, during that talk, he said, "Oh, and I just tried out this new approach to scaling called FAST, and it went pretty, and it was really interesting. And I was positively taken by it. And I thought, wait." So this was, I don't know, last spring or maybe even last winter. And I reached out to James and said, "James, we've got to have an experience report on this. This is yours is possibly the second use of FAST, but FAST has intrigued me since I first heard about it at Agile Open Conference, when Paige Watson and Ron Cortell were giving talks about their use of it at, of all places, Blue Cross in Seattle. And James willingly signed up for here we are, September. So thank you, James, and take it away.
My pleasure. Thanks. So yeah, I'm James Short. I've been practicing Agile since 1999, started out with extreme programming. And I've been helping Agile teams with scaling, Agile companies and teams with scaling issues for the last 13 years now. And I'm here to tell you about the most promising approach to scaling I've yet seen. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got about 55 minutes of stuff to talk about, and we've got a good chunk of time. I think we've got 2 hours total. This topic generates a lot of questions, so please raise questions as you go. It's kind of hard for me to pay attention to the chat as I'm giving the presentation, so just raise your hand in Zoom and I'll call on you, or one of our hosts can, if they see your question, they can raise their hand and relay it as well.
Yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. We'll pop questions to you.
I do see a question about the slides. Yes, I plan to share the slides. I don't know if you all have a way of sharing them further, though.
Yeah, we will share it via our website as well as on YouTube.
Great, great. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, let me just bring this
Everyone,
back up.
we do have a Slack channel. We'll be publishing a lot of stuff on there as well as YouTube. So go.
Okay. So if we're going to talk about scaling, I think we need to first define what scaling is. And I have a very specific definition of scaling. Scaling for me means that we're increasing the number of people who are working on a set of related products or code bases, and so that they resulting in multiple interdependent teams. To me, that interdependency, that need for one team to work with another in order to get their work done, that's the hallmark of scaling. If you got a large company with a lot of teams that are working completely independently and never talk to each other, that's a large company and it's a lot of teams, but it's not a scaling problem. Scaling problems occur when you have interdependency between teams. Now, scaling is important because, as we all know, the number one way to deliver faster is to reduce scope. But the number two way to deliver faster is to eliminate waste. And the number three way is to improve your technical capability. And way, way, way down on the bottom is adding people. So the real title of this talk is Scaling, the Last Thing You Want to Do. Now, I'm joking, kind of. People reach for scaling as sort of a quick and easy way to deliver faster, but it's not really a way to deliver faster. It has a lot of costs and a lot of challenges, and it can actually tank your ability to deliver. That said, a lot of companies are working on problems that cannot be delivered with just your standard 2-pizza team of 5 to 7 people. So they do need to scale, they do need to add people, but don't reach for scaling as your very first choice if you want to go faster. If you're having trouble getting things done, look at those other options. Look at your waste, look at your technical capability, look at your scope. But this is a talk about scaling, so we're going to assume that you have a legitimate need to scale. So let's talk about that. When I first started my scaling work, again, I've been working with companies doing scaling work for over 13 years now. At the time, the default was, and it actually kind of still is, to have component teams. And a component team is where you've got each team focusing on one or more technical components of a larger system. So these folks are going to work on the database interaction layer. These folks are going to work on the front end. These folks are going to work on the back end. It's a really common model, but it's flawed because now anything that you want to do requires the coordination of all these teams. And cross-team coordination is the death of interdependent teams. That leads to so many problems. Anytime you have two teams that have to coordinate, you're likely to have cross-team bottlenecks and you're likely to have errors. And people are hiring me because their companies, their organizations were grinding to a halt. One company I worked with, they had 40 teams and they were all interdependent. So there were 40 teams working on basically the same product. And they hired me because they weren't able to scale any further. They would add new teams and their performance would not increase at all. They couldn't get any more work out of these teams. So the very first thing I did was to do a value stream analysis. We chose three sort of example teams, and we traced the value creation. So we went from idea to finished software. Where is value being added? Where is waiting happening? What's happening at each of these steps? And what I found is that on these typical teams, it was taking 2 to 3 months to deliver 2 to 3 days of actual work. And this was not uncommon. This is really typical for companies that have these component teams. So they were getting killed by cross-team dependencies. It was really hard to get on the schedule of other teams because they were spending so much time waiting. They started doing a lot of multitasking, but that was a vicious cycle because they're doing a lot of multitasking. Now they're not available when somebody needs something else done. And this, of course, is true for all the people they depend on as well. So it's really hard to get on the schedule of other teams. And there were a lot of errors between teams because there was so much time and so much miscommunication. So for this company, 40 teams again, I got representatives from every team into a room, physical big room, and I asked them to write down everybody that they depended on and everybody who depended on them. When I say depend upon, what I mean is you depend on a team when you cannot finish your work without that other team doing work for you. Not that you use what they produce, but that you need them to do work on your behalf in order to finish your work. That's a dependency in a large-scale system, a large-scale set of teams. And so we wrote all that down and we put it on very large pieces of paper. Oh, for the comment, this is actually a real thing. It's not just a Zoom background. Thanks, by the way. So we put all this on a big sheet of butcher paper, and this slide here is the result. we called this affectionately the spaghetti diagram. Every index card is a team. Every line is a dependency. That's what you get from a component team model, is that kind of mess. Everybody depended on everybody else. Now, it wasn't a surprise that they couldn't get anything done. So the question is, of course, what do you do about it? Well, I helped them redesign their team responsibilities to sort of a classic, what I call horizontal scaling model. We were looking to create full ownership teams, what I called full ownership teams. That's a team that has full authority and responsibility for a particular part of the product or market. Some people call these feature teams. Lately, there's a book called Team Topologies, which is quite popular, talking about this approach. It's popularized the term stream-aligned teams. But whatever you call it, the idea is that the team can take full ownership of some part of the product. And it worked. This was the result of the redesign. It resolved the bottlenecks, allowed the company to keep growing. They reached 67 teams before they started running into new problems, and most of those were around product management. But it still wasn't perfect. There were several problems. The one that was most noticeable, though, it was that it was really hard to create cross-functional teams that had all the skills needed. This company had 40 teams. They only had 10 user experience designers. They only had 3 security folks. Now, arguably, they needed to hire more user experience designers and more security folks, but we had the reality of what we had was that that wasn't the case. And even if we had everybody, if we're talking about a team of 5 to 7 people, it's really hard to get everybody you need in one cross-functional team. Also, we were brittle to changing business strategy over time, over years, because this work was done in, I think, 2015. Over time, the needs of the organization changed, and each team had a very specific responsibility. So if we needed to put more effort in this area, we needed to make that team bigger. And if we needed to put less effort in this area, we need to make that team smaller. And if the team gets too big, now you've got to redesign. You've got to split the teams up and figure out what the new responsibilities are going to be. That's expensive. The original team design took us months. Now, there was a lot of change management. It was a big change. In theory, what was supposed to happen is that architecture team was responsible because of Conway's law, which is we were doing the reverse Conway maneuver. We were designing the architecture of the organization to reflect the architecture of the system we wanted. So the architecture team was responsible for deciding the responsibilities of each of these teams. And so they were supposed to maintain the organizational structure. As the organizational needs changed, they were supposed to sort of keep up with making sure that the team responsibilities matched. But frankly, they didn't. They forgot. They had too much other stuff to do. It wasn't something that needed to be done all the time. By the time the need rolled around, they'd forgotten that it was one of their responsibilities. So what happened was that, excuse me, the team responsibilities started drifting. We had a really nice, clean structure. Over time, that drifted. It became less clear, less crisp, and teams started taking on responsibilities that didn't really fit with their original clean design. Another problem that we encountered with these streamlined teams, this horizontal scaling approach, excuse me one moment. Was silos. Each team was focused, had a really clear area of responsibility, which was great, was really clearly focused on its own goals, which was also good, but each team was small, which meant that they could only have a small area of responsibility. There were 300 people in this engineering, in the product organization, 200 engineers, team of 5 to 7, 40 teams of 5 to 7 people when I left, 42 teams actually, and then that grew even further. Any one team is going to be looking at a very small piece of the overall product. So any work that required a sort of a cross-product focus, a big picture focus, they struggled to getting that done because each team was so laser focused on its responsibilities, they didn't do a good job of collaborating across teams. And although cross-team response dependencies were reduced, they were still a challenge. There's a lot of dependencies here in this slide. Not as bad as that original spaghetti diagram, but still a lot of dependencies. So we had a lot of questions to deal with about how to deal with those dependencies, when to deal with the dependencies, what do you do when you're waiting for somebody else to get something done for you? So all this is to say is that this horizontal scaling model approach, which I've had a lot of success with, is still not perfect. In 2019, I heard about FAST, fluid scaling technology, from Ron Quartel and Paige Watson. And my first reaction to it was, this is brilliant. It actually gave me the same feeling that extreme programming did when I first heard about it back in 2000. This is brilliant and crazy, and I don't believe it could possibly work. I've got to try it. I've got to find out if this could actually work. In the team topologies for approach, we're scaling horizontally. We're adding teams by, we're adding people by adding new teams, each of which is isolated in theory. Ideally, each is working on their own subset of the product. They're independent and they're autonomous. But the problem with this approach is it requires careful design. This work that I did with that company, with the 42 teams when we were done, we couldn't have all 300 people in the organization participating in this design work. It just wasn't possible. So we solicited representatives from all parts of the organization. I actually met with every single existing team when I started. I said, who do you respect and trust to represent you in this design work? And we chose the people who were most respected, most trusted, and did the best job of representing the cross section of the organization. But it was still centrally managed. The design work, we got a lot of input, did a lot of workshops asking people to submit their perspectives, but it still was centrally designed, even though we shared it out. And then when we implemented it, we had to do it in kind of a top-down way. We said, here's the design we came up with, all your thoughts, give us your feedback, but eventually we had to say, this is to the design. And then when we rolled it out, it was a big bang implementation. We had the old team structure and we had the new team structure, and I couldn't figure out how to do it incrementally. I would have loved to do it incrementally, but we couldn't just split off some teams and put them in the new design and have the others in the old design, because how would they interface? So this sort of classic approach I've been using, it always made me a little uncomfortable, because it was kind of the opposite of what we want from Agile. It was centrally managed, it was big bang, it was top down. Ron's approach, this FAST idea, it was inspired by open space technology. If you've ever been to an open space conference like the Agile Open conferences here in Portland and Seattle, we have Agile Open Northwest. You know that they're self-organized, they're bottom up, and FAST can be implemented incrementally. So self-organized, bottom up, incremental, it's much more in the spirit of Agile. So I was really excited about it. Additionally, I have a lot of experience with self-organization. I first heard about it fairly early on in the context of the horizontal scaling work I was doing. And I actually started using self-organization as part of that horizontal scaling work. We'd come up with a new design as collaboratively as possible, define the teams, and then what you see here is the actual self-organization exercise for that company with 42 teams. Each table represents a team, each balloon, some of which I've blocked out for confidentiality reasons, each balloon has the name of the team written on the balloon. And what would happen is people would come in here, they would learn about what all the teams were and who the product manager or technical product manager would be for each team, what kinds of work and responsibilities the team would have, what kinds of skills they needed on the team to be successful, and they would choose for themselves which teams they wanted to join, within some constraints about how many people we needed. And my experience was that this always resulted in teams that were much more cohesive, much more willing, much more ready to hit the ground and be productive right away than in the traditional sort of manager-driven assignment approach to organizing teams. So I had a lot of experience with self-selection in the context of organizing teams. So I knew that that was a good idea. Also had a lot of experience with open space conferences. I love open space conferences. They are my very favorite type of conference. I knew both of those approaches worked really well. FAST is a combination of self-selection and open space. I had to try it. And then 2 years went by. I was talking about FAST as much as I could. I even mentioned it in my book. Ron said that he heard me talking about it when I was talking about my book at the Philly XP conference. I had been talking about it a lot, but I didn't have a chance to try it. And then last year, I was asked to help a company scale. So a really big healthcare organization. Ron mentioned Blue Cross earlier. This was not Blue Cross. This was a different healthcare organization. They had over 100,000 employees. That's what consultants will always tell you about the companies they worked at. And all that is true. But the department I was working for, Truth in Advertising, it was 45 people. They had 13 product managers. They had 24 engineers, they had 5 executives, and they had an administrative assistant. That was 45 people. They were doing data analytics work, and it was very domain intensive, very, very much in the details of what happened in the actual healthcare work in the clinics. Now, I was originally planning to do a classic horizontal scaling approach with these folks, what I knew to work well. And the reason for that was that I didn't think they'd have the appetite for trying something sort of bleeding edge. Then I saw this. This is something that we created as part of our initial work together. I asked them to tell me, well, what are all the products that your department is responsible for? Remember, this is a department of 45 people with 24 engineers at the time that we started. Every little sticky here, this was done using Miro, which is the online whiteboarding tool. Every little sticky, every little colored square represents one product. Every circle represents a group of related products, and every arrow is a dependency where one product has a dependency or a relationship with another. I saw this and I thought, oh boy, I don't think a horizontal scaling approach is going to work. There's just too many dependencies here. They have too many products. And to make matters more exciting, their stakeholders are constantly changing their priorities. So I thought, well, I don't think a horizontal approach is going to work, but let's try it. Let's go through let's do the work. So we had created that change team. We had, gathered a cross section of the organization to do the design work. And we did some initial design work, and this is what they came up with. I've blanked out a bunch of the details again to protect my client's confidentiality. But each square here represents one team. Each red line represents a dependency. Remember, a dependency means that the team must have another team do work for them in order to finish their own work. This was the best design we could come up with. And it was rife with dependencies. It was not a great design. And there's too many teams for their size. There's 7 teams here. They only had 24 engineers. That's 2 engineers per team. That's some really small teams. Reality was going to be that they were going to have one team with like 7 or 8 engineers, and then a whole bunch of teams with 1 or 2 engineers on them. Also, their business priorities were constantly changing, as I said, so their teams were going to need constant reallocation, and that wasn't going to be a good idea either. So it was a recipe for bottlenecks and errors, and it was going to be what you see here in these slides. The bottleneck might have moved around from time to time, but there was always going to be one team that everybody else was just hammering on. So we talked about using a vertical scaling approach instead. If horizontal scaling is adding people by adding teams, vertical scaling is adding people by making the effective size of your existing teams bigger. What you do here is you have people self-select onto sub-teams according to their skills, interests, personal relationships, and what's best for the organization. In other words, fast. And so we looked at what that would involve. The company, the people, the representatives on the change team that I was working with considered their options very carefully. looked at the pros and cons, and they decided to try it. Let me explain more about FAST. In the words of the FAST guide, FAST is a lightweight, simple to understand, and simple to master method for organizing people around work that scales. To summarize, the main event of FAST is the FAST meeting. And in the FAST meeting, you bring everybody to work together as a full collective group. You visually represent your business goals on a wall. You let the collective self-organize into teams to break down and do the work. And then on a short cadence, you synchronize and repeat the above step. That is really all there is to FAST. It's a very simple method. Now, there's some other bells and whistles, but I think the entire FAST guide is something like 20 pages. You can find that at fastagile.io, by the way. So what did that look like in practice? Well, again, the main activity of FAST is the FAST meeting. So every 2 days, on Monday and on Thursday, Wednesday was we condensed all the meetings, and they had quite a few meetings. We condensed all the meetings of the department into Wednesday so that they could focus on their work on Monday and Tuesday and Thursday and Friday. So on Monday and on Thursday, effectively every 2 days, we would gather together. Now, this was entirely virtual. One, it was during the pandemic, and two, they were a remote, or everybody in the department was remote. So we used Miro to gather together. First, each team summarized what had happened since the last FAST meeting. And it's real brief, like a stand-up, so just a sentence or two. And then next, the product manager reviews the goals of the FAST collective. So what are we trying to accomplish together? In this organization, it was usually one of the executives that would review the goals. Typically, that hasn't changed, but if an increment had been finished, then a new one would be pulled in, and there'd be a brief description of what that increment was about. Or an increment is a deliverable. Next, product manager, or after the product manager reviews the goals, people volunteer to lead teams. These folks are called team stewards, and it's a temporary role that only lasts until the next FAST meeting. So it's just 2 days. Each steward explains what their team is going to work on. Typically, it will be one of the deliverables, one of the priorities that has been explained as the group's priorities, the collective's priorities. But it could also be unlisted works that's important, such as automation or refactoring or something else that's necessary from an engineering standpoint. After the team stewards have described what each team is going to work on, everybody else self-organizes into those teams. Again, based on their knowledge, interests, personalities, and what's best for the organization. And then each team works in whatever way the team steward feels that they want to work. What the teams do tend to standardize on sort of a typical way of working, though. It's not a sprint. It's not a commitment. They just work on the team's focus for 2 days. And then at the next FAST meeting, they're done. And the process repeats. People do tend to rejoin the same team until they finish whatever priority or increment they're working on, but they can move around if they want. So they do work, they reconvene 2 days later, and then the process repeats. And that's basically what FAST is. That's the entire process. There's usually a lot of questions at this point, so I'm going to pause here and go ahead and ask questions, take questions from the audience.
Do you want hand raised, or we should just speak out like I'm doing now?
I'm sorry?
Do you want us to raise hands or just speak out as I'm doing now?
Why don't you go ahead, David, and then if anybody else has a question, just raise your hand and I'll call on you.
So there's something that's very attractive to do for the developers, but that might not be aligned with business goals. How do you make sure you have the right number of hands on the problems that are aligned to business goals?
Well, what you'll see here in this slide is that there's a list of business priorities up on the wall. We used valuable increments for that purpose. And I'm going to go into more detail about idea flow and how priorities were created in a minute, or later on in the talk. But remember the fast meeting starts out with, after the review of what's been accomplished, a reminder about these are our priorities. And so people just generally chose to work on the business priorities. In fact, I would have liked them to do a little bit more work on things that were not explicitly related to business priorities, taking care of some of the automation and so forth that they needed. But the general tendency, and this matches my experience just in general with engineers, was to try to please the folks who were saying this is what we need to do. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Jim, it's Trace. Like, how did the teams gain context as these rotations occurred? You know, did they solo, did they pair, did they mob?
That's a really good question. I'm going to get into some of the challenges that this group faced later on, but one of the challenges that they had was that prior to moving to this model, they were all working in silos. They were all independent. So it's sort of a classic IT environment where they had way too many customers, way too many products. And so what happened is that as stuff came in, it just sort of randomly got assigned to folks, and they would develop sort of deep but narrow expertise in exactly what they were working on, and did not have the ability to work on anybody else's work. So as a result of this, they did not have a tradition of collaboration in this department in the slightest. So it was a real challenge for them moving to the fast model to learn to work in teams. And this did cause some problems down the road. But over time, the knowledge started to share, but I wouldn't say that they were really smooth on it. If I had the ability to teach them sort of extreme programming practices and similar, I would have, but it was out of my scope. Did that answer your question, Trace?
It did, thank you.
I see that David has his hand up. David G. David.
Hello. Hey, thanks for the Zoom background. Really like it. Your name is on it, by the way. Yeah, I just put a question in there. I've been in a couple of very difficult spaces where trying to ask management or trying to find a way to get them engaged, even just to do a couple of hours of training, has just been practically impossible. And I know something like this, in certain cases, there's no way in hell I'm going to be able to persuade. So I'm just wondering if you have any tips on how you engaged right up front, I guess, how you were going to introduce it, or were you specifically, hey, brought in to do this, so they were already under the impression that this is what was going to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was not brought in to do this. In fact, I was surprised to discover that we were doing this, because my initial, so the way they hired me was weird. They were very confident in themselves. And so they hired me to do something very small, which was that they wanted me to teach them to do some training courses on Agile planning. And so I did that. And one of the things that you have to do if you're going to do Agile planning is have teams. And it turned out in the course of preparing for this training, I discovered they didn't have teams. And so what I taught them, well, they didn't really have teams. Like I said, they were all very siloed. So they had organizational units they called teams, but they didn't have people who were interdependent on each other, like you see in a real team. You didn't. A real team has a shared goal, depends on each other to get their work done. They did not have teams in that way. So one of the things I taught them was, well, if you're going to have team, if you're going to do Agile planning, you're going to have, each team is going to have a charter, and that charter is going to define what the purpose of the team is and what their context is. And we got through that training, and they said, wait. And I said, before we can go on to the next phase of the training, go do this, figure out what the purpose is for each of your teams. And they spent a couple of months on that, and then came back to me and said, we could really use your help defining our teams. And so I said, okay, well, what you have here is a scaling problem. I'm not surprised you're having trouble with it. I'll help you figure out how to do a horizontal scaling model. And before we do that, tell me why. Tell me why you want to do Agile. Tell me why you want to have teams. Why is your existing approach not good enough? And they said, well, our engineers can't take a vacation, and they're stressed out all the time because they're solely and they can't learn from each other. They're solely responsible for all these products, and we've got too many, we've got too much for them to do. We want to improve our engineers' quality of life. We want to improve quality of life for all the employees, in the department. I said, great, we're going to work with that. And then everything proceeded from that. It was all about how are we going to improve the employees' quality of life? How are we going to resolve this siloing problem? And originally we thought, well, that we're going to do a horizontal approach, but that turned out not to work, as the slide showed. So the change team that I had formed around this included an executive, it included a data engineer, it included a visual engineer, it included a product manager, and actually a couple of different kinds in this. It included an operations person. So I had a really good cross section of the organization. So once we came to the conclusion, yeah, we've got to go with a vertical approach, they went and convinced the rest of the organization, and particularly the executives, that this was a good idea. The executives were still really nervous about it, but they trusted their people. And that's what convinced them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, sounds good. Thank you.
In general, if you want to convince people to try something new, you have to have a problem that you're solving. Nobody is ever going to do fast because of fast. Nobody's ever going to do agile because of agile. Or if they do, it's going to be something horrific. Safe. But if you've got a problem to solve and you focus on solving that problem and you have the trust of the people with the authority to approve that solution, then you can make a change. If you don't, work on getting that first.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I see a question in the chat. Why do you say safe is bad? I'm just going to read a section from my book on that one. Okay. So there's a section of my book called "What About Safe?" I'm going to just read this out because this is the best description of my problems with safe that I've got. Safe is a popular approach to scaling Agile. Unfortunately, I've yet to see it work well. Companies tend to adopt it with great fanfare, only to silently drop it several years later. I'm not sure why that is. Critics of Safe claim it's not really Agile, and it does have a certain whiff of process over people and prediction over adaptability. I suspect the real reason Safe fails, though, is twofold. First, Safe emphasizes being enterprise-friendly, which, in the organizations I've seen, results in insufficient organizational investment in Agile ideas. Organizations tend to stick with their existing top-down command and control predictive mindset. Second, Safe has very little to say about how teams coordinate, which is the hardest and most crucial problem in scaling. Prior to Safe 5, it suggested feature teams, same as LESS, which is large-scale Scrum, but it was extremely wishy-washy about it, and it didn't include the details LESS provides to make them work. Safe 5, released in February 2021, replaced feature teams with a discussion of team topologies, which at least provides more detail. But that's a horizontal scaling approach, which is a step backward. It requires very careful attention to the design of team responsibilities, which again, Safe doesn't mention, let alone help with. Safe's SOP to team coordination is an every few months program increment planning session, also known as big room planning. It's predictive, not adaptive, extremely labor intensive and draining, and it doesn't work well with remote teams. Although some people do praise its ability to get teams on the same page, my experience is that it's the first thing companies drop. Unfortunately, there's not much else to Safe, so once PI planning is gone, you're left with a bunch of teams with limited ability to coordinate. All in all, Safe pays lip service to a mishmash of Agile ideas without seeming to truly understand them. I don't recommend it. So that's
Okay, so I just jump in there because you mentioned horizontal, and prior to that, when you were talking fast, you said you tried horizontal. It sounds like there's a choice there. When you go to companies, you may go for horizontal or vertical. Can you just dig down just a little bit more on the horizontal versus the vertical, the fast vertical?
Yeah, and then I'm gonna let David S have a chance to speak.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry, guys.
Yeah, the horizontal approach is sort of the classic team topology style approach that I was talking about originally, where that report of the company with 40 teams, that was a horizontal approach.
Mhm.
We defined a lot of small teams. And we tried to make them as independent as possible, using streamlined teams, but also some other types of teams as well, because when your teams are that small, they can't all be streamlined. The vertical approach, of course, is having more people act as a single team, which is what you get with FAST. Now, the FAST group the FAST collective, they call it, does break up into sub-teams, but it does that on an every 2-day basis, and they're constantly reforming, so they all know what's going on within the collective. So they act as a single team. David, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I understand this, but I just want to confirm my understanding. So the pink, whoever has the business goals are deciding the pink things, and the technology teams are organizing for essentially components of that every 2 days. So the yellow stickies are, here's what the technology team chose to do to push forward whatever the business goals are in the pink. And then those are, is that correct?
That's basically correct. I mean, they're not just technology teams, in that each team did include a product manager on the team as well, presumably somebody who'd been working on the business problem, but call it an implementation team then.
And then the stewards could be the product managers or the technologist, or are they only technologists?
Technically, it could be anybody, and as FAST is written, but in this organization, they had a real problem with engineers not taking, with product managers sort of overriding engineering decisions. So we made the call to say that the team stewards had to be an engineer to try to balance that out a little bit.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, I see that there's
Jim,
still
Trace again. Oh, sorry. Good.
Give you a chance in just a second, Trace. I do see some additional questions on SAFe in the chat, but since this isn't a talk about SAFe, I'm going to let those go. I'll be happy to talk with people about them afterwards if they want. Trace, go ahead.
We've talked about this separately as well, but how high does this scale? Like you mentioned, your team was about 45, which I think was the size of Ron and Paige's experiment. Sounded at Primera sounded similarly in size. How do these work as teams of teams, and how do these ease coordination at a portfolio level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe Ron's experience at Primera capped out at 60 or 65 people. And I know that Steve Kuo has done this as well at Blue Cross, but I'm not sure how big their FAST collective was. Ron's theory is that this can scale to to Dunbar's number, which is about 150 people. But I've not actually seen that. What I did experience was that there was plenty of headroom at the size that we had at 45 people. It did not feel strained at all. I think we could have probably at least doubled it, but I wouldn't have added that many people all at once, but there was definitely plenty of room to add more people. Does that answer your question, Trace? Doug, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So I had a question. In this particular organization, they have lots of products. How do engineers who know nothing about another product work on it and be effective in 2 days?
It was a real challenge, but even though the siloing, the history of siloing was a challenge, and working through that siloing was a challenge, but the every 2 day part was not the reason for that challenge. It was just that people were now needing to work on things that that they didn't necessarily have experience with, because folks' siloed areas were not always selected. But because it's self-organized, people would go to the places that they had expertise. I see that we have another question from David. David, I'm going to ask you to hold that. I'm going to share some more slides, and then I'll have another chance for questions in a few minutes. But to finish answering your question, Doug, even though the FAST meeting is every 2 days, that doesn't mean that you switch teams every 2 days. And I want to show you what the FAST board looked like, and also how people moved around between the teams to provide some more context to that answer. Is that okay with you, Doug?
James, one other question though, was this a organization this was legacy code they were dealing with, correct?
Oh yeah, very legacy. It was actually a data analytics group, so it wasn't traditional code. There was a lot of Tableau and MS Microsoft, whatever their data analytics product was. And there was also a lot of backend database SQL type of work, but not your traditional sort of Ruby, Python, C, Java type stuff.
Got it. Thank you.
I want to show you what the fast board looked like. And again, I've left lots of time in this talk for questions because there usually are quite a few. But let me give you a little more context, some more examples to help you understand what we're talking about. So we used Miro for our fast board because we didn't have the ability to meet in person. And this is what that Miro board looked like. Here's the previous iteration. We kept at the beginning, remember at the beginning of the fast meeting, people would talk about what their team had done over the last couple of days, and the previous iteration is what they'd be speaking to. But most of the action happened here in the current iteration. On that part of the board, we had the working agreements, the current business priorities, and you'll notice that that's much bigger than the sort of simplified example I gave you, and then the list of all the teams. And here we had stickies with every team member's name on it. So when people self-selected onto a team, they would drag the sticky that had their name onto it into the team box that they wanted to join. And that's how we knew where people were joining. In the sort of in-person version of this, the way people would self-select, it would be more like an open space conference. People would write down on a big sticky, my team is going to work on this, and then people would physically walk over to the person whose team they wanted to join. But here we're using Miro, they would drag a sticky with their name onto it, onto the corresponding team. Let me show you a close-up of the team box. What we have here is the team focus, whatever the team's focused on here, and the steward will have dragged his or her sticky into this box here. Now, every Agile method should be customized to the needs of its organization. And we were no exception because we were dealing with an organization with a lot of different products and this sort of unique history of having a lot of people who were siloed working on all these different products. We made some choices that I don't think you should make, at least not as a starting point. So don't copy this directly. In particular, we had a lot of valuable increments. A valuable increment is something that you can actually ship. It's a deliverable, something that gives value to the organization that is also shippable. Some people call these epics, but I prefer the term valuable increment because it's not about the size, it's about whether it's valuable on its own. So we had potentially up to 8 valuable increments that the teams could be working on at a time. So we had to say which valuable increment is each team working on. But I think in a typical fast implementation, you're going to be focusing on 1 or 2 valuable increments, so you don't need that. Also, because the teams had a lot of, or the department had a lot of maintenance work to do because they were data visualization group, there was a lot of data quality stuff that just had to be kept up to date. I think some of that could have been automated, but most of it wasn't. But because everybody was heavily siloed, only one person could do that maintenance. So we had this small maintenance part of the board over here, where after the team self-selected, any maintenance work that had to be done in the next 2 days would be added to whichever team had the person who could do that work. The idea was that that person would do the work with the rest of the team and start sharing that knowledge out more broadly. I don't know if that ever happened. I think what tended to happen is people would just go do that work. That wasn't the intention of the design, but it's not surprising. So if you're to build this yourself, I would say just have the team focus the team members, and that's all you need. Similarly, in the business priorities section, this was a pull system. So we're pulling from left to right. So the work that's being prepped is on the right and the work that's done is on the left. A lot of this is stuff that I don't think you would want as a starting point in your fast implementation. On the left, whenever a valuable increment was finished during one of those 2-day cycles, they're called value cycles in FAST, it would get moved into the complete box and then erased at the end of the next value cycle. That I would keep. We also had this wrapping up box right here. After work was complete but not shipped, there was this fairly lengthy period where they had to go back to the stakeholders and get their feedback on it. And the stakeholders wouldn't necessarily respond right away. The stakeholders are actually actual clinicians, doctors, nurses, and so forth. It could take them, clinical directors, it could take them a while to get back. So there was this sort of holding zone where something that was done but not shipped would sit, and that's the wrapping up box. Preferably, that's just in progress. It's in progress until it's done, but they kept things in a wrapping up box. I think your implementation of FAST, if you do it, will have an in progress area of some sort, but we had a lot of stuff in progress. I would cut out most of this. I prefer to keep a small amount of work in progress. There was this idea of work that's ready to start. I think that's fine. You definitely want to have sort of what's on deck, what's going to happen next. So once the team finishes a valuable increment, they can pull the next one in. So there's nothing wrong with this one. But this blocked section that was next to it, if there was some work that was being worked on and then needed to get feedback from a stakeholder, it would move into the block section. Team would work on something else. Teams would work on something else, and then it would come back out. Ideally, you don't start work until it's completely ready to go. And then we had this being prepped area. Again, work that's being prepped, that's just the in progress, that's doing the work. But in this organization, being prepped meant going out and talking to stakeholders. It took a long time to get that feedback. So they had a special area for work being prepped. This actually caused problems down the road, as I'll describe later, where now the engineers couldn't participate in prepping the work, talking to the actual stakeholders, and it led to a disconnect between engineers and the work, which caused some dissatisfaction. And then finally, the small maintenance bucket, which we've talked about. So if you take out all the things that I wouldn't start with, what you end up with is a fast board that looks like this. You've got a complete section, a small amount of in progress, and a list of what's up next, and then any number of teams according to whatever size organization or collective you have, with a team focus, a steward, and the team members. Generally, I'd recommend however many people you have in your whole group, in your collective, divide that by about 4 or 5, and that's the number of teams you probably want to allocate. Again, every team is going to have to customize FAST to their needs, but this is where I would start. Start simple and then add to that rather than starting complicated and taking stuff out. Hey, David, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I feel like I'm asking a lot of questions here, but I have 3. You can answer the ones you decide to answer.
Sure.
This feels a little like Kanban to me, which implies that it's hard to predict when things are going to get done. Is that true? Question 1. Question 2 is...
Well, let me answer one at a time.
Yeah, sure.
This is a continuous flow system, and Kanban is a continuous flow system. So yeah, they're very similar in that way. Kanban, the method is of course got a lot about helping an organization see where it needs change. But Kanban, the planning technique, is just basically continuous flow, and that this is also continuous flow.
So
does that answer your first question?
Yeah, almost. So I agree with what your qualification there. But one of the issues with Kanban is you get better throughput, but prediction of tasks that have multiple atomic units is difficult. Is that, you may disagree with that, but assuming you don't, is that an attribute of FAST as well?
So FAST uses an approach to prediction that the company I was working with didn't use. They didn't do any prediction at all. You can do what Arlo Belshry calls Disney line planning, which is where you just measure when something enters the queue and then measure when it leaves, and your weight from this point is X. I think that's sort of the classic approach to prediction with Kanban. What Ron Quartel has in the FAST guide is Wisdom of the Clouds wisdom of the crowds based prediction, which is that for any given valuable increment, you ask everybody in the collective, how long will this take? And you take the average of their response. Makes a lot of sense to me. If you read Wisdom of the Crowds by, I think, I forget the author, is it Jeffrey Katzenberg or something like that? He says that crowds are very good at making those sorts of estimates. So I would have been interested to see how that worked, but they didn't feel a need to make predictions, so they didn't. Also, their stakeholder environment was so chaotic. They were always constantly changing what was up next. So predictions beyond what this is what we're working on right now wouldn't have been super useful anyway.
Got it. Thank you.
Then-
So let me,
Mhm.
that answers you. Let me ask the two other questions because you may answer them later. I don't want to take up all your time by you answering my questions when other people might have questions. The other questions are, how do you do architecture in this context? Because sometimes that loosely aligns to a business goal. And then you had mentioned something about having the developers attached to the creation of the problem. And how does that solve? So those are my two questions. I'll let you decide when to answer them.
Yeah, why don't you hold on to those and we'll come back to them after
Great.
I've gotten a
Thank
little
you.
bit further. Aaron, go ahead. I know you've been holding your question for a while now.
Oh, no, that's no problem. Great. Thank you for the talk. I appreciate it. So I assume you'll talk about architecture later, because obviously that was sort of one piece of it, is how tech cool driven is the environment, so that you have lots of modern, very efficient automated tools and to be able to hit these really quick sort of time windows versus a more, you could call it legacy or just heavy environment, which could be packages, ERPs, things that are sort of out of your architectural control, I guess might be the fairer way to put it. How do you see that playing out? Because I've used Cynefin, sort of like inverted it. So I never applied the continuous flow like this system does, but sort of use it to just bucket things in the ERP or big package environments. And that did help, because you could kind of say simple over here, complex over here, complicated, chaos, whatever. And, you could build, think of them as almost squads. We didn't really call it that, but sort of like SWAT teams around it. But I'm just wondering, when you have a architecture you control, and it can be cool people, cool tools, cool, I think you know what I mean by all that, versus things that are way out of your control. You have lots of contractors, lots of third parties, lots of people doing split work. Is there a better fit for FAST, or do you find that it doesn't matter? So hopefully that made some sense when I asked that question.
I don't think I fully understand what you're getting at. Let me talk about how architecture was managed in this organization.
Okay.
In general, FAST does not prescribe an approach to architecture. But remember how I said that stewards would volunteer to work on either the business priorities or something else that was necessary to continue to make progress. Doing some architectural work could be one of those things. Now, architecture is a word that is extremely overloaded and means different things for different people. And I'm not going to try to define it here, but that could include that sort of team to think about architectural types of things, could include evaluating technologies. It could include doing some more abstract design work. It could include doing technical spikes. It could include trying to refactor an existing design to see if another approach is better. These are all things that a team could choose to do. Now, how do you stop a team from going off into the weeds and just, doing resume-driven development, which is what I take your cool architecture comment to mean? The fact is that what I see in this type of environment is that everything is very transparent. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. And so if anything, the push, the bias is towards not doing enough necessary work and just focusing on getting things out the door rather than going on flights of fancy. In this organization, the way architecture worked, there was a lot of stress about design work, and sort of a sense on the part of some people in the organization that they knew the answers and nobody else was qualified to speak on it. It sort of came back to some of the siloing problems that the organization had. And one of those folks was part of the change team. And what they did was they carved out the existing architecture group that already existed as separate from the FAST implementation. If that makes sense? So there was sort of this blessed group of architects that had to approve any design decisions that any team made. Now, is this the way I would have chosen to do it? No, but it is what they decided on and what would work for them. Does that help at all, Aaron?
Yeah, no, it does actually. And I think the only thing I would want some clarification on is based on the embedded systems that you're working with, meaning the heritage or the thickness of the architecture. If it's a third-party platform or third-party package, which you don't control a lot of the approaches to doing the work. It's very prescribed. It's very configuration screen driven, or it's very it's sort of waterfallish, and it's hard to break it up into agile pieces because the thickness of their architecture. How do you see FAST coexisting with that, or do you not see it coexisting in those environments?
I mean, I think it's sort of independent of whether you're using FAST or not. This organization, again, they were doing data analytics, and so a lot of their work was in tools such as Tableau,
sure.
which are not your traditional engineering, programming languages. But there was still work that had to be done, and so people formed teams to do that work. The way that the teams do their work is not prescribed by FAST. Although the original FAST implementation, they used extreme programming and mob programming. But in this group, they didn't use extreme programming and they didn't use mob programming or pairing. And they were still successful. I think they would have been more successful if they had used some of the XP practices, but they were fine without it. So the answer to your question is, whatever your team needs to do their work, that's what they do.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and keep on moving here. So this was just to bring your attention back to this slide here. This is showing where I would suggest you start if you're doing a remote implementation of FAST. You're going to need some sort of board. You need some business priorities, which show what's been finished, what's in progress, and what's next up. And you're going to need boxes for your teams. In an in-person environment, you wouldn't need the team boxes because people would just hold up a sticky and folks would walk to join them. But in a remote environment, it's helpful to have this sort of boxes on a Miro board. Now, you're probably wondering how the team switching worked, because this is a common question. And Aaron, I assume you don't have a new question, so you can put your hand down. And
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I just wanted to make sure I did call on you again if you had another question. So yeah, you're probably wondering how team switching worked. Well, because we did this all in Miro, I was able to record who selected onto each team for every single FAST meeting. And at first it was every 2 days, literally Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then later on, they changed to be just Monday, Thursday, Monday, Thursday, with occasional stints at trying 1 week value cycles. But they actually ended up preferring the 2-day value cycle to the 1 week value cycle. So what I'm showing you here is how people moved between teams. Each column is a single valuable increment, and each row is a FAST meeting. And then the tiny little stickers whose names you intentionally can't read, that's a person. So the arrows show how people are moving between teams. New means that that's the first time the team, a team is formed to work on that particular valuable increment. This little skull means the valuable increment was discarded for some reason. And the check mark means that the valuable increment was completed. So I'm going to show you how things progressed over time. And what I want you to know is the first couple of weeks were pretty chaotic, lots of movement as people figured out what they wanted to work on, but then it settled in. They started finishing their work consistently. People moved in response to needs, and they had a much better cycle time than before. The yellow triangle that you're going to occasionally see means that work was blocked, and so people had to move off of that team and work on something else. So you can see here that as new stuff came along, people would just seamlessly move into work on that, and then when it was finished, they would seamlessly move to something else. It was, I think it was really successful, actually. And what you're seeing here as well is that at the beginning, it took maybe 4 or 6 weeks before they delivered the first thing. But after that, they started delivering something pretty much every 2 days. And this is a valuable increment, something that actually moves the needle for the business. And most of those valuable increments only took 2 or 3 value cycles to complete.
Tell us about the skulls and the exclamation points.
The skulls are when a valuable increment was abandoned. They decided that they didn't want to ship that after all. And the exclamation mark means that the valuable increment was blocked on something. So let me summarize what we saw from FAST
Quick
overall.
question there.
Let
Someone
me
mentioned about-
summarize, and then I'll take a question. I'll take your
Okay,
question.
thanks.
So overall, I would say FAST worked really well, despite being sort of the worst case scenario for FAST. We had siloed developers. We had a lot of unrelated products. There was no team level coaching, and they didn't really have a lot of experience with Agile engineering practices, such as you find in extreme programming. It was really easy to adopt. We did have 4 months of change management where we worked through, are we going to do a horizontal model or a vertical model? We talked to people about what was going on. But once we actually started working in the FAST way, they had it figured out within about 2 weeks from when we started. It's very low overhead. The FAST meeting is about 20 minutes, and it's twice a week. So your overhead for FAST is 40 minutes a week. And it worked as intended. People fluidly allocated from one thing to the next. On the downside, people felt pressure to deliver every couple of days. They saw it, we called them iterations rather than the official FAST term, which is value cycle. And people sort of conflated that with Scrum and thought, well, that means that we need to sign up and commit to delivering something every 2 days. And that was very stressful for folks. And they had a lot of trouble ramping up on unfamiliar work because they were so siloed, and because they didn't have any of the collective ownership practices from extreme programming or the experience to teach other people how to work on the stuff that they'd worked on. So that led to difficulty working as collaborative teams. But other than that first point, I think those second two were very unique to the situation that we were in. And even despite that, I think FAST worked quite well and better than what we had previously. Now I can take some additional questions. Somebody was speaking up earlier. I don't know who it was.
Yeah, it's me, David. Hi. I know someone brought this up before, and you also kind of alluded it to again. Just sort of reiterate those people that do not have the skill set. I'm guessing that once they're running around, they're picking up new skills. That to me doesn't sound like a 2-day, kind of jumping around. It sounds to me that you need to be on a team and learning before you get into the habit of moving. Could you sort of go into that a little bit more deeper?
Yeah, I think if you look at this, it's a little hard to see in this slide, but what you'll see is that people, other than that first couple of weeks where you had a lot of movement, people would tend to join a team and stick with it until that team was done, and then they would move on to something else. So it's not really moving around every 2 days. It's having the opportunity to change every 2 days, but that was typically only done in response to the team finishing its work or their work getting blocked.
Okay, I get that. That's good.
Susan, go ahead.
Hi, thanks very much for doing this. I had a couple of questions around you just mentioned Agile, making sure that the team understood the processes, that it was easy to adopt. I wanted to understand what were some particular processes or Agile and Lean mindsets that you would want to focus on, and kind of dovetailing off of that. Where do you see Scrum Masters or Agile coaches being used, not only in the first few months of implementation, but after that, 6, 12 months down the line?
Yeah, those are both great questions. Something you should know is that this organization had a real deficit. It didn't have any Agile coaches. It didn't really have, it only had one people manager. And she was much happier leading the architecture team than doing people management. So they didn't have a lot of sort of what people would consider ground level Scrum Mastery type of coaching ability. I think so. What and my scope was fairly limited. Remember, they had sort of this. I don't know if it's because I'm in a medical field. I do see this kind of behavior from doctors. They kind of felt like they had all the answers and only need me to help them with a couple of things, and then they go off and say, "Oh, we need you to help with something else." So there was only so much I was allowed to help with. I would have loved to do some coaching with them on the engineering practices and also how to work well as a team, but that's not something that they had room for me to do. What I did do though was I did provide some training for them on how to share leadership, which I feel is important in this type of environment. And I did some training with them about how to create working agreements as a collective organization, but also work together in their teams. And I did work with them on chartering their teams, chartering their various areas. And I think they could have really benefited from Scrum Masters and people with that more how do teams work effectively together mindset, but they didn't have that. And I think that's something they were lacking. Does that answer your question, Susan?
Yeah, it does. And kind of brings up another question. You talked about chartering and team agreements. Would this be something, it seems like it would be done kind of at the collective level, right? At the larger team of teams. Would it be reviewed on a regular basis? Would you do retrospectives of some sort as well?
I'm going to get to chartering next. In fact, I'm going to have to
Awesome.
move a little bit faster soon. But I'm going to talk about idea flow, and that includes chartering. So I'll get to that in a moment. The retrospectives, we originally planned to do every 2 weeks as a full group collective retrospective using a tool called Gather, gather.io. And then they found that difficult, so they moved to once every month. I'm not sure where they're at right now. I think how to do retrospectives well is still an open question for me, particularly in a remote world, because the tools for doing large group collaborative exercises are still kind of weak. Gather.io is a tool that allows you to dynamically form breakout sessions because the audio and video is transmitted according to how close your little avatar is next to somebody else in this kind of game world environment. And that
Gather.town, right?
Gather.town, not gather.io. Yeah, gather.town. Thank you. Yeah, so we use gather.town and it made it possible, but I wouldn't say it was smooth. Is that good, Susan?
Sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Quick question. Oh, sorry. James, a quick question. RACI. How does this impact RACI?
Define that.
Oh, RACI is that horrible old responsibility chart for your personnel. Guys, help me here. I always forget what the responsible, what's that? Actionable. The specific.
I think A is authority.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds
C
like
is
you haven't dealt with
consultative, and then I is informed.
that.
Yeah.
So essentially, these are that kind of you're funneled in these specific roles that when you want to do independent stuff, meaning jumping around, guess what? Your management team or your PMO is going to say, well, you can't do that because we have to capture your task, etc. And they're defined by the RACI role. So it sounds like
and sorry to jump in, but that's like a budgeted issue, right? Like, so that's like, so I guess there was a larger question around RACI and budgeting, right? That would all line up into.
That's good. Yeah, I would accept that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So let
Sorry
me
to
talk
interrupt.
about idea flow because this ties into this. This company did not use RACI. So it wasn't an issue. And I in my work, I always work with whatever I'm given, right? So if they had needed something like that, then we would have used it. But FAST may not have been appropriate if they were heavily command and control. Although there were a lot of challenges in this environment, one thing that was great about them is they were extremely open to the fundamental ideals of Agile, which is pushing decisions down to the people who are doing the work and creating autonomy and self-reliance. I don't know if self-reliance is the right word, but creating autonomy where people had responsibility for their own work and decisions about how that work was done. So there was no PMO that they had to worry about. There was no command and control desire to say you can only work in this area. So it just wasn't an issue.
You lucky guy.
Yeah.
James,
if it had been, FAST might not have been appropriate. I mean, if it was so much an issue that we couldn't do FAST, then we wouldn't have done FAST.
Yeah.
But my experience, if there's so much of an issue that if it's that much of an issue, Agile probably isn't appropriate anyway. You should go with more of a traditional PMO style waterfall approach or spiral, preferably.
Great,
I'm going to take one more question from Trace, and then I'm going to move on.
There are a couple of quick questions in the chat, James. How many developers quit during the process?
During the process, none. After we finished, there was a fair amount of turnover, mostly due to the Great Resignation. They were specifically moving on for, let's see, I just talked to them, my contact there last week, and 6 months after we finished. And he told me that people, they lost a fair number of people due to the job market. People are getting big pay increases of 30 to 100%. And also the healthcare industry is in a very uncertain state, a lot of money loss, and people were leaving due to that uncertainty. But there was some turnover resulting from what they call the operating model, and I'm going to get into that when I talk about sort of the conclusions at the end.
Okay.
My question was related. That's it.
Okay.
What I think was the other quick question is how you evaluated working better. What metrics you used to identify, or what baseline you used to identify that things were working better.
So remember that when we started, we had very specific goals. We wanted to improve the life of employees based on 4 criteria, which I don't have right in front of me at the moment. But they were something along the lines of being able to take vacations without feeling stress, or be able to take time off if you got sick or something like that. Learning from each other, so not being stuck always on the same thing. And there were 2 others that were sort of along those veins, along those lines. So those were the criteria that we were using to evaluate whether it was successful, and it 100% accomplished those goals. I'm going to talk about some of the downsides, but let me talk more about how things worked. Because even though I said that we had a lot of time for questions, we've spent a lot of time on questions, so I'm worried we're going to run out of time. Susan, quick reminder that if you don't have another question, you can put your hand down in Zoom. Okay, so I want to talk about idea flow. My experience is that every organization, every scaling problem has its own need for the way planning is done. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about idea flow. Idea flow is how ideas move from initial concept to becoming deployed software. So in this organization, we had our own idea flow as well. And in past presentations about what happened, I get a lot of questions about, well, how did that happen? The answer is you do whatever you want. FAST does not prescribe a specific approach to idea flow. It does suggest that you have a single product manager, and that product manager used Jeff Patton's story maps. But I think that assumes that you've got one cohesive product, and that's not what we had. So we used an entirely different approach. So just briefly, FAST is a continuous flow system, also known as Kanban system, which means that we didn't use iterations or sprints like Scrum and Safe. Instead, there's this continuous flow of work that's constantly being refined at all levels. It starts out with the portfolio leads, which were the executives, and area liaisons, which were PMs. An area was a particular domain, a type of problem that this department was tasked to resolve. And there were something like 8 or 9 different areas that they were responsible for. And in most organizations, a signal area would be an entire department's worth of work, but they had 8 of them. And so the portfolio leads and area liaisons are responsible for going out, talking to stakeholders, understanding what's important. And then what they would do is they came back and used that information initially to create a draft purpose and a context diagram showing how that area's work fit into the big picture of this department's work. And so purpose consists of vision, mission, and indicators. This comes from Diana Larson and Ainsley Nee's book, Liftoff, which I also shamelessly used in my book. And the context diagram also comes from that book. So the first thing they did was created this charter, which is supposed to be updated every 6 months or so. I'm not sure if they have kept that up or not. They also take that information and build visual plans, which show how all the valuable increments that they could do in order to accomplish their current mission fit together. Story mapping is one type of visual plan, but there's other types of visual plans as well. Impact mapping from Goiko Adzik, my cluster mapping, perspective analysis. These are all different approaches to doing your visual planning. This is an example of the visual plan for one of the areas that we had, and so they would talk to stakeholders, learn their interests, tie that back to what they're currently trying to deliver from a mission perspective, create visual plans based on that, and constantly update those visual plans as things changed and as work was completed. And this, of course, is happening for all the areas simultaneously. So this is what all of the visual plans for all of the areas look like. Each box is an area, and you can see we have a lot of them. Again, each one of these areas, each one of these visual plans could have kept the whole department busy for months. The portfolio leads got together, again, these are the executives, and decided which valuable increments from each of these visual plans that the department would work on first. And this is what that looked like. This is called the Medusa diagram. Down here on the right-hand side, they had sort of the top priorities from each area, the visual plan for each area, top 4 priorities-ish. And those would condense down into 2 separate lists, the sponsors list and the department's backlog. Actually 3. So theoretically, they were going to spend 50% of their time on sponsor priorities, 25% of their time on departmental priorities, and 25% of their time on quick wins. Those are things that had high political value and low effort. And all of that was managed in this, which is the complete Medusa diagram. The executives would get together fairly frequently, I think every week, to talk about what had been delivered, what was up next, and to sort of hash out those priorities. That would tie into the FAST meeting in that the stuff that was next on deck would go into the ready to start box of the business priority section of the FAST board, and the work, when it was moved into the in progress section, would be moved into this section of the Medusa diagram. So to summarize, we've got chartering, which sets sort of the big picture direction, visual planning, which defines the valuable increments that each area wanted to deliver, prioritization, where the executives decide which of those increments from which of the areas are going to be prioritized next. And then there's getting ready, identifying a product manager who's going to prepare the increment for development, ready to start, increments waiting to be chosen by a team, in progress. Teams have chosen the increment and they're working on finishing it, and then complete when it's done. Except for chartering, all of these stages happen all simultaneously. And the charter is refreshed every 3 to 6 months. David, go ahead.
Yeah, you kind of answered it, but every 3 to 6 months. So the execs are pretty much, how often are they getting together to to initiate the next increment or the next cycle?
Every week.
Every week, okay. And how do they feel about that? Because obviously, if you're in a big kind of stuck organization, that would be very uncomfortable. This is the same place that you're talking about, is it?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that.
And so for larger organizations that have that kind of gridlock, this is probably not going to work for them because they do quarterly cycles or whatever. This one, I think, is this the same company that you're working with that you said before didn't have all these kind of blockers?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, remember I said that this is not a fast approach to idea flow, because my experience is that every organization has its own unique needs that constrain what and define what is a good idea in terms of idea flow. So I've always designed a different idea flow for every organization. So this is what was needed for this organization, which had a huge number of stakeholders, a huge number of products, and far, far too few people to finish everything.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
So the outcomes of using this idea flow, again, based on my observations and talking to the people in this department, executives had total transparency and control over priorities. It successfully worked around the fact that they had way too much stuff to do, which my contact at that company defined as poor strategic prioritization, which I think is a pretty good way of describing it. In the previous approach, where everybody was working in silos, there was a lot of off the books work in that people would just ask the engineer, can you work on this thing? And the engineer would scramble to get it done. And then they would scramble to get the next thing done. And the PMs were constantly doing stuff sort of out of band without asking an engineer's opinion and so forth. That was greatly reduced, although it wasn't eliminated. It's very easy to adjust priorities. They could adjust priorities whenever they wanted, and those priorities would change at the next fast meeting, which is at twice a week. And it had the possibility for improving PM collaboration. In this organization, the PMs were, well, I'll get into it a little bit later. It was very competitive, and they saw themselves as they acted as if they were in competition with each other, in that I need to get my stuff done. And if that means you don't get your stuff done, that's fine. In fact, maybe that's the way it has to be. And they each had their own area that they sort of was their baby. And it didn't matter what the overall benefit to the organization was. They were in charge of, their job was to get their baby, out the door. So one of our goals with this design was to improve PM collaboration, try to break down some of that us versus them mentality the PMs had for each other. And that was why there was a design where the person who was responsible for shepherding a valuable increment, the valuable increment steward, wasn't necessarily the same person who was in charge of a particular area. And that was built into the design. I didn't go into details on that. They were supposed to pair. Now, when I look at some of the records that I have, I don't see a lot of that pairing, but that was a theoretical part of the design. Now, on the downside, in the old model where each silo had an engineer assigned to it, there was a really strong ownership for that engineer, and they actually talked to their stakeholders. In this new model, where everybody could work on everything, that unintentionally reduced engineer ownership. And that was actually one of the reasons that people stated when they in the exit interviews, when those people who left. Again, the main reason we had turnover among the engineers is they were seeing much higher opportunities for pay elsewhere, but they also did state that feeling a less sense of ownership over their work was a factor. Because of that PM mentality, this desire to, this is my thing and I've got to get it out the door no matter what, there was still some off the books work. And the design did not address the root issue, which is that they had way too many products and responsibilities. Now, we did not have the ability to address it, so I don't know that that's really a flaw of the design. It's more a feature of the design, but it's still a fact. The root issue of a lot of this organization's problems was a higher level executive who's saying yes to everything. And we couldn't address that, but it caused a lot of problems. All right, I'm going to move on to the last piece of this. So we've talked about the FAST meeting, which is the main event of FAST. We've talked about idea flow, which is how the valuable increments feed into FAST. Now what I want to talk about is what happens once the teams actually start the work. How do they coordinate? How do they bring new people in? How do they know what other teams are working on? And the approach that FAST uses for that is called discovery trees. Let me just get my notes back on the right page here. Sorry, I inserted that piece about idea flow into my process and into my outline. I've sort of lost track of it.
Don't worry, you're doing great. It's a
Oh, thank you.
pretty intense presentation. So
So after the FAST meeting, each team is free to work however they like. This was challenging for this company because of that siloing that they had before, and the management just wasn't really ready to manage team dynamics. They didn't have any budget for on-the-ground coaching, just some high-level training, as I mentioned earlier. It did work out, but there was some stress and turnover that might have been preventable. Yeah, I won't tell that story. This wasn't really an issue with FAST specifically, but more with moving to team-based work. I think they would have had the same issues with any team-based approach. And team-based approach was the only solution to solving their fundamental goal, or addressing their fundamental goal, which is we want to have more opportunities to learn from each other. We want to have we want to be able to work on more things. We don't want to be stuck here and be the only one who can solve a particular problem. That required a team-based collective ownership approach, but they really, really struggled with that collective ownership. It actually, in fact, I think FAST might have helped with some of that, because if they had used sort of traditional teams that are long-lived, the personality conflicts that existed would have sort of been stuck in place. Whereas with FAST, the folks who were having personality conflicts were able to move away from each other. So there is that. But it might have also hurt because the teams weren't stable. And one of the things that you get with stable teams is they slowly tend to work through that forming, storming, norming cycle. It's not guaranteed, though. Also, the original FAST implementation used mobbing. There was no appetite for mobbing or even pairing in this company, and they didn't use any of that. Now, FAST teams track their work with discovery trees. It's a just-in-time hierarchical breakdown of the work that needs to be done for any given feature or increment. It's a hierarchical outline. So if we take this example of getting ready to work, we wake up and get presentable, and getting presentable involves brushing teeth, taking a shower, getting dressed. It's an outline. It's got multiple levels, hierarchical outline. Discovery tree just takes that, puts each element on a sticky note, makes it horizontal, and that is your discovery tree. It's done just in time. So when you're starting a task, you turn it yellow and you put an icon on it saying, I'm working on this task. Now, in FAST as defined, because they're using mobbing, there's no need to say I'm working on this, because each team has its own discovery tree and they're just working on the thing they're working on. But they were all working, even in their teams, they would all work on individual things. So we used an icon to say, I'm working on this thing. When you're done, you mark the task green and you move on to a new task. If a task is going to take more than a couple of hours, break it down and move your icon to one of the subtasks, work on that until it's done, and so forth. And then when the entire subtree is done, you mark the parent task done and you erase the subtree. The discovery tree is a view of your current work. It's not a history, it's not a plan, it's just, this is what we understand about our work right now, and it's constantly changing. Each task, remember, is only a couple of hours. So you're going to be, and if you've got multiple people working at the same time, this is going to be changing basically all the time. Anyway, this continues in this way until all the work is done. And then when the entire subtree is done, well, you delete it. Again, it's just about the current work. This did not go well for this organization. What I like about discovery trees is that it's a lightweight view into the current work, and we did have the ability to see what each person was working on. But there was a lot of confusion about what each person was working on. They had trouble breaking down their work. They were used to thinking of a task as being a week of work, so breaking it down to a couple of hours was really hard for them. Also, there was something going on with the way people were rewarded in this organization, because everybody needed to prove that they were worthy of being there. So there was this desire to use the discovery tree as a record of their individual accomplishments rather than just sort of a snapshot of what's happening right now. So they really struggled with the idea of deleting things that weren't done, that were done. They also had a tendency to, so they had a tendency to build out the entire tree and then say, I'm going to work on this piece, this piece, this piece, this piece, and this piece. So they sort of stake out their territory. And there was also confusion about what to put in the discovery tree versus the issue tracker. Would I use discovery trees again? Maybe one more time. I'd like to see if these problems occur again. Some of them do seem really unique to this organization, but I have another way of sort of breaking down valuable increments to stories and tasks. And although when I saw the discovery tree, I thought this makes a lot of sense to me, I had so much trouble explaining it to this group that I'm not sure if it makes as much sense as I think it does. And like I said, I have another approach to breaking down work that does make a lot of sense to people when I explain it to them. So I'd probably go with that if I continue to have trouble with discovery trees. Again, though, this is not the main thing about FAST. This is just a way of tracking what's going on and visualizing what each team is working on. You could use whatever approach you want, just like you can use whichever approach you want for idea flow. And I don't think it would change the fundamental nature of FAST. Got a few minutes for questions, and then I do have a conclusion. Aaron, go ahead.
Yep. Thanks. Did you have any conversations with sponsors about how rewards and sort of measurements occur in the organization, or did they just sort of say go for it? I mean, what was the sort of awareness that you were given to how the organizational dynamics are?
That is a typical, when I do organizational change work, that is one of the first things I look at in a typical engagement. But because in this one, they hired me for this piece and then said, oh no, we need help with this piece. And then, oh, we need help with this piece. I didn't get to go through my normal process. And that's something I normally do a readiness assessment before we do anything. I didn't have the opportunity to do that in this case. So no, I didn't look into the rewards structure. And I think there's something going on there. Does that answer your question, Aaron? I'll assume it does. Trace, go
Yep,
ahead.
it does.
Okay, great. Trace, go ahead.
I'm not sure if I mentioned this to you when we spoke, but I heard at the Agile conference in a self-organization session, a horror story of this very, very large legacy enterprise that decided that they got religion, they were going to try this, and they were going to unconference all the things and flew all their teams to HQ into a giant warehouse and said, you're self-organizing now, go self-organize. And all the best people form a team together. A bunch of people quit, went to HR, people were crying. Like it was, people were not ready for the level of self-organization. Like, how did you facilitate a legacy organization to actually kind of know what was going on, and what makes this succeed when it failed so terribly for that enterprise?
Well, we did months and months of change management, and it sounds like that organization didn't. You can't, of course, when you're going to self-organization isn't tossing people in a room and taking your hands off the wheel and saying good luck. You do need structure around it. I think FAST provides sort of a nice minimal amount of structure, and you also need to prepare people. So part of the way we did the change management is we had we had so much. The change team was responsible for going back and collecting feedback on what they were doing from each part of the organization that they represented. Each part of the organization had 2 change team representatives on it. We also had weekly Agile town halls where we described what was going on and solicited feedback and answered questions. As we finished pieces of the design, because obviously this wasn't just straight FAST, it was sort of a customized version with lots of, especially around idea flow, lots of special pieces. As we did that design, we shared it at that FAST meeting or that Agile town hall and got people's feedback. So people knew what was coming. Then when we actually, before we started FAST, we did a number of experiments with first just a small number of people acting as a FAST team. We identified collaboration as an early risk. And so we started doing little mini experiments where we said, let's do a 2-hour session where we get people to volunteer to try FAST. And we did it with just 1 team. And then we did it with 2 teams. And then we did it with 2 teams and the same technology, so that they had to talk to each other to work on the same technology. And then we did it with 4 teams. Like, we did all this stuff to sort of lay the groundwork. And even then, I would say that they didn't struggle with the self-organization, but they definitely struggled with collaborating as a team. That's something that they didn't have a lot of skill at. Even though, although they didn't have the budget to have me do coaching, they did have me come in and do some training. So I did some training with them about what's the process going to look like, how do you share ownership in a team, let's create working agreements together. So those are all the things we did going into this to make it successful. Does that answer your question, Trace?
Very much so. Thank you.
Yeah. We're going to run out of time. So David, I see your hand still up. I'm going to let Ron ask his question, then I'm going to have to go into conclusion.
So you mentioned that you settled on the FAST meeting on Mondays and Thursdays.
Mm-hmm.
I did not hear you say what you used Wednesdays for.
All the meetings that were on all the other days were condensed into the Wednesday morning, and Wednesday afternoon was set aside for sharpen the saw, which was any sort of training, self-research, improvement, something like that. Does that help out?
Yep, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go into our conclusion. Oh, I did see Nelson has a comment in the chat. Is it truly useful to have the detail? So talking about discovery trees, is it useful to have the detail at that level for 2 days of work? Does anybody actually look at it during that time? I think it is, because I don't think you're gonna have the other teams looking at what your team is doing typically, but if they want to be aware, they can. And also the people who are actually working together, since in these groups, they weren't pairing and they weren't mobbing and they weren't in a shared team space, the only way they could know what other people were doing is either ask them or look at the board. And having the discovery tree meant that they could pull that information by looking at it rather than have to interrupt people and say, what are you working on? Some of the product managers were kind of micromanaging as well. And when we started, they were having hour and a half long stand-up meetings every single day. So I was able to do some coaching for them to use the discovery trees to find out what was going on rather than sitting down with people and asking them to explain themselves every morning. So Nelson, I hope that answers your question. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Conclusions and recommendations. As I mentioned, it's been 6 months since I stopped working with that organization. They started using FAST in January. I did some follow-up work with them until March, stopped working with them in March. And then just last week, I talked to my contact there about how's it been going. So there's goods and bads. what I've heard is FAST has created a high degree of transparency. The whole department understands the body of work to be done. They were able to match people to the work to be done. He said resources, but it's not my favorite word. They're able to match people to the work to be done just in time. And the executives have a really high ability to dynamically adjust priorities. Something that was I was very happy to hear about. He says they're pretty good at collaborating now, speaking about the teams. So that was the biggest problem they had. But, being put into this sort of forced collaboration environment for 6 months has apparently helped them resolve those issues. I've not gone back and observed any of the teams since, so I'm not sure what's really going on, but that's what I've been told. He also said that another surprise for me was that having the team stewards be engineers has really improved the engineering leadership in the organization, which is a strong plus because that was a weak point for them previously. And they also brought in, when I left, they were planning on bringing in people in India. And my advice to them was to form a new FAST collective, that because I didn't think it would work across time zones. But my contact told me, actually, the new offshore engineers just joined the FAST meetings and started joining the teams, and they were up to speed, or not up to speed specifically, but they were participating and contributing immediately, which was a really pleasant surprise. I didn't think it would work across teams. That's the kind of result I expected for adding people in the same time zone or close time zones, but not across a 12-hour time difference. So that was cool. Things that didn't work out. We have a lot of domains. It's hard to bring engineers into problem scoping. So most of these issues are around just the sheer volume of work they had. I think this is kind of the root cause for the remaining issues they have. Engineers no longer own a specific domain. And as I said, that was a reason that people stated as for unhappiness in their exit interviews. Engineers aren't always able to work in the preferred domains because the work in progress was limited. It used to be everything was in progress all the time, and it took them months of cycle time to deliver. Now they're delivering every couple of days, but it does mean that they're focused. And so some engineers' preferred domain is out of scope, and so they don't always get to work on the stuff that they want to work on. There was definitely issues with sharing ownership of existing responsibilities, and still problems with knowledge transfer. Again, they were supposed to, those maintenance responsibilities, they were supposed to bring that to the team and have the team work on it, but I don't think that's what actually happened. And engineers weren't able to really stick with a particular area and learn it thoroughly, so they're bouncing around a lot, and that's been a source of problems for them as well. I think a lot of these problems will be resolved by scoping down the responsibilities of the organization. And there's some stuff happening that I was told about that I can't say more about, that hopefully will address that. So that's what they're currently working on, is reducing their scope or allowing there to be more focus. So to conclude, FAST is a group of people who self-organize into teams on a frequent cadence. It is easy. Benefits of it are that it's easy to incorporate specialties. There are a lot of different specialties in this environment, and because they were so siloed, and although those silos were a source of problems, they were really able to move themselves around to where they needed. If you remember that diagram that showed how people moved, people were moving so that they were associated with a work that needed their skill set. That worked really well. It's incredibly responsive to changing business needs. It's resilient to people joining and leaving. Collective ownership is a potential challenge. It's something I'm going to be looking at when I do this again. And team dynamics were a challenge for this company. I think that has more to do with their lack of coaches and their lack of engineering management. But that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on in the future as well. My recommendation, though, this has got a lot of potential. This is, as I said at the beginning, the most promising approach to agile scaling I've yet seen. It solves the problem I see with horizontal scaling. I wouldn't say things were perfect on this first trial for me, but a lot of the things that they had trouble with, I think, were more about the environment than FAST itself. So I highly encourage you to give it a shot. Because it can be done incrementally, you can do this in your existing organization just by identifying 2 teams that are working on closely related work, that have strong interdependencies. Teach them collective ownership and collaboration skills if they don't already have them. And provide coaches if you can. And then introduce FAST and combine those 2 teams. Wait for that to stabilize, and then you can start adding more people assimilating more teams like the Borg. Do call it a collective. Stop when the fast collective is feeling strained, and then you can repeat that by forming multiple stream-aligned teams. You won't need any of the other types of teams if you can do these larger 50-person stream-aligned teams to focus on individual products and capabilities. So again, that's fast. People self-organize around team stewards and do that on a fast cadence. It's a very solid approach. I highly recommend that you try it. Cannot say it's perfect. I can't say that I'm 100% sure it's good in most cases, but it's definitely worth trying. That's what I got about that. Thanks for your time today.
Super
Cool.
interesting, James. Thank you.
Thank you.
Applause. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. I would suggest to people to also look at Large Scale Scrum Les and Craig Larman and Boss Foti. FAST is very similar to that, and how they create feature teams and reorganize the company to do that. So there's a lot of similarities there, James, and some differences, right?
I think less is also a vertical scaling approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I think they're compatible, right? I think also you point out some interesting characteristics that organizations have to think through from a cultural perspective on how to do this align around products and services, which is very difficult for some companies to make that change. You know, move Robert and Karen over here because you're breaking down the fiefdoms, right? And anyone that's ever done this before, it becomes a political nightmare that you have to work through to make this happen. So it was very good, James. Thank you very much, and I learned a lot. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time, everybody.
So I'll save the recording. We'll put the recording on our YouTube site. We'll those who don't know it, I've been sending emails to the meetup. I just sent an email with our Slack link and our YouTube link and everything else. So we constantly put this stuff up there for everybody to use. And James, if they have any questions, I guess they can reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. My email's on the screen and my Twitter as well. And you can also find more information about me at jamesshore.com.
Perfect. So thank you, James. You're wonderful. We learned a lot, and we want to thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank everyone else for joining. If you have any questions, just reach out to Ron, myself, or Gopal, or others. And again, thank you so much, James.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Have a good night. Watch the Emmys.
Bye.